This is Talk of New England. With Barbara Anderson and Jim Braude on New England Cable News.
Welcome to Talk of New England. I'm Barbara Anderson.
And I'm Jim Braude. This is our second week with you on Talk of New England, talking politics in general and the November elections in particular. If you didn't see our first show last week, you missed an opportunity to see two people who many believe will be running against each other and debating quite a bit, Governor Bill Weld of Massachusetts and Congressman Joe Kennedy. Also, for those of you who saw last week, I should say, and I'm sorry to announce this, that for those who are expecting an announcement of the second round of debates between Barbara Anderson and Joe Kennedy, they haven't been set yet, Barbara, have they?
That was so much fun, though. Anytime, Joe.
We promise by next week we'll have the second date for you.
For those also who didn't see it, the first thing we did was introduce each other. For those of us, for you who don't know us, and for those people who are watching from other states. But we're not going to go through that whole thing again.
Thank goodness for that.
But we do want people to know that Jim and I have been debating, arguing, discussing for the last 6 years since my organization's been around a while as a taxpayer group in Massachusetts. Jim's organization has been around, but they finally organized and came in as a cohesive element in the political scene.
Cohesive is the nicest thing you've ever said about our organization, I want you to know.
And Jim became the executive director at that time. So we've been doing debates, ballot questions, and now we're going to be doing a election year analysis up until the election of congressional races and legislative races and ballot questions.
And we've been doing that out in the world for so long, we decided to get legitimate this year. So here it is. I don't know about you, Barbara, but I actually got a lot of feedback on the show. Overwhelmingly positive, but there were two letters that I thought were worth mentioning. One person who actually liked the show quite a bit said he was obsessed with the fact that in the background there was a football game going on, so I feel I should say to him the score was 41-7, the Patriots lost, you don't have to watch the screen in the background. And the only truly hostile letter I got was from a guy who writes all the time who said, and I quote, I believe, that we get more expert in that political analysis from watching Wayne's World than we do from watching Barbara Anderson and Jim Braude. So we'll disregard that guy at least.
I don't know. I think that's pretty accurate.
You think it was?
Yeah. I got mostly positive feedback, but generally people wanted to know what I'm doing hanging out with the likes of you. But that's a question we've been getting for 6 years now.
Indeed. Over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be with you through the Sunday after the elections. We're going to be talking about races all over New England. That's political races. We're going to start with the ones in Massachusetts. We're going to talk about the 1st Congressional District where the Democrat John Oliver, and I have to say in the spirit of full disclosure, the man who formed my organization 5 years ago.
Because if you don't, I will.
Is running against Republican Patrick Larkin.
And we hear that's a pretty hot race.
And
in the 2nd District, Richard Neal, former mayor of Springfield, now a congressman and the incumbent, is running against Anthony Ravosa, now a city councilor, and that looks like it's shaping up to be an exciting race.
And the 3rd Congressional District, Joseph Early, who barely squeaked through with barely 40% in a multiple-person field, a guy who bounced a lot of checks and people were supposedly pretty upset about, against Peter Blue, two anti-choice candidates running in that district that includes Worcester and a lot of new territory. In
the 5th District, Martin Meehan, who was the man who slew the Chet Atkins Dragon, versus Paul Cronin, a former congressman from years ago who's now come back, planning to run against Chet Atkins, is now running against Marty Meehan, and that's going to be a very exciting race.
And in the 6th CD in Massachusetts, Nick Mavroulis, you've been reading about him a lot, long-term congressperson indicted several weeks ago, squeaked through by barely 1% over Peter Torkelson, former state rep, former candidate for lieutenant governor on the Republican line.
In the 10th District, Gary Stubbs, incumbent, running against Dan Daly, and also a kind of interesting hitch to this race, there's an independent, John Bryant, running, who may be playing the role of spoiler, and we'll talk more about that too.
And there are also some other races in Massachusetts that are not on your screen, but we're going to be talking about from time to time as well.
Yes, because for instance, the Barney Frank McCormick race might be something of a sleeper. People say that that's going to be more interesting than people think. There's Markey versus Zahn. Kennedy doesn't have any opposition.
So he'll probably win that one, don't you think?
And probably will, yeah, probably with a fairly substantial margin too. Should we predict and look really, if we know what we're talking about?
I think Kennedy's got it.
Jim and I finally agree. We think Kennedy's got the 8th District, and Moakley will be running against Martin Conboy.
And we're also going to talk about what's happening in other states throughout New England, including New Hampshire, where Deborah Arneson, in an incredibly interesting campaign, is running against Steve Merrill,
who is the taxpayers guy. And the U.S. Senate, John Rowe versus the governor now, Judd Gregg, who is now running for the U.S. Senate.
And then we move on to Vermont, where Governor Howard Dean is running against John McClory.
And the U.S. Senate, Patrick Leahy, the incumbent, versus James Douglas.
And in Connecticut, sitting Senator Christopher Dodd, a tough challenge from what we understand from Brooke Johnson.
And my favorite race outside of Massachusetts, the House race between Rosa DeLauro and Tom Scott, the legislator who led the tax revolt in Connecticut last year.
And finally, we'll be talking about a race that really has garnered national attention. Bob Abrams, who squeaked out a victory over two high-profile women candidates, as well as Reverend Al Sharpton, against the sitting senator, first-termer Alphonse D'Amato. That's what we're going to be talking about with all of you.
And to talk about the races, particularly the congressional races, tonight we're going to have two, I don't like to use this word, losing congressional race.
It's factually accurate. You don't mean it in a critical way.
No, I mean, actually, it takes a lot of courage to go out there and run, considering what it's like running for office nowadays. So they both lost, and we'll be bringing them in to talk about all the congressional races and help us to analyze them as people who know from the inside what it's like to run for Congress, and they might have a pretty good idea of what might be happening out there.
But before we get to that, there are two races that Barbara and I really couldn't resist talking about ourselves, and those two races are one happening in Connecticut, where anti-tax activist, as he was described by Barbara a couple of minutes ago, Tom Scott, is running against the incumbent, Rosa DeLauro. What's the story with Tom Scott? He was the guy who led that huge anti-tax rally in Hartford a year or so ago?
Yeah, as I understand it, usually taxpayer revolts are run by, well, people like me or Howard Jarvis, outsiders who come in to fight inside politicians. But in this case, Tom Scott was one of the leaders in for the taxpayers in Connecticut, sort of the antithesis of Governor Lowell Weicker. And
why do you think Insight was one of the largest rallies, I'm told, ever in Connecticut, clearly the largest rally ever in Hartford? Why were there so many people? Are you part of that group that believes this was purely a reaction to the income tax that Weicker filed?
Am I part of that group?
Yeah.
You know, all those other crazy people who actually think that because people got hit with a major income tax increase after Weicker promised solemnly when he was running for office that he would not raise taxes, and then came in with the biggest tax increase.
I think
you
that's
actually
the issue.
think the tax revolt had something to do with that?
Well, except the question.
Is that the question?
No,
yes, I do.
No,
yes.
because there's a subset of that, Barbara. The question is not just, was it a tax revolt? Was it a revolt against the income tax itself, which wasn't extraordinarily fair, or was it a revolt, as you said, against the fact that the week before the election, Lowell Weicker went on television and said having an income tax in Connecticut would be putting fuel on the fire of this problematic economy. My sense is that what the problem was there, as well as the problem in places like New Jersey, where Jim Florio is ready to be lynched.
Not to mention Washington, D.C. and George Bush.
It wasn't so much that people were upset about the tax necessarily, but upset about being lied to by an elected official. Don't you think that was a major part of it?
I think it was, and it ties in with the debate we're having right now in the presidential race.
In the presidential race. And there's also another hot tax debate, which is one of my favorites, just a couple of miles to the north of us, where Deborah Arneson, who's a sitting state rep, won a primary, being willing to say that she was going to support an income tax in New Hampshire, an income tax in the state that has no income tax, an income tax in the state that has no sales tax. You're not supposed to say the word tax, and as a matter of fact, my understanding is her opponent, Steve Merrill, has taken the so-called pledge, saying, never will I sign a new tax package in New Hampshire.
First of all, it is not a so-called pledge, it is the pledge that candidates, if they know what's good for them, take in Massachusetts, or I'm dreaming here, take in New Hampshire and have been taking for years, and Steve Merrill won his primary as someone who had taken the pledge. In New Hampshire, unlike you, they don't have the initiative petition process. So if they ever allow a state income tax or sales taxes, they don't have any grassroots ability to go out there and repeal it. And that's why it's so important for candidates to understand that and take the pledge.
Barbara, you're an expert on the property tax. My understanding is the property tax, which we both agree is not terribly fair, is about the highest in the country in New Hampshire, isn't that right?
Yes.
And my understanding, at least from the Arneson campaign, is that her income tax proposal would do the following. 75% of the money that was raised from the income tax would go to property tax relief, including some relief targeted to low and middle income families. Secondly, another part of that income tax would go to offset something called the business profits tax, which she said is hurting the influx of businesses into New Hampshire, and some of it used to restore services. That's a state that doesn't even have a kindergarten program for young kids. So tax fairness rather than a tax increase seems to be the issue.
Thirdly, the people in New Hampshire may have been born at night, but not last night, and living right on the border of Massachusetts, they watched for years while our politicians said, give us a sales tax and we'll cut the property tax. So we gave them a sales tax and the property tax went up. The income tax in Massachusetts began when somebody promised if we had an income tax, the property tax would drop. Our lottery began with this promise. It never happened. We finally had to cut property taxes with the initiative petition. They don't have an initiative petition up there, so they know very well if they ever get the income and sales tax, they're stuck with higher property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes. They're not crazy in New Hampshire.
A little too quickly. If you're running for governor in New Hampshire, and someday maybe you will, you're running for governor, you agree
My
that...
kind of state. Live free or die.
And you agree that the property tax is burdensome. What do you do to deal with that property tax burden if you're in that state, if you're concerned about things like the quality of services in that state? But forget service, just tax fairness. Property tax, too burdensome, too high? What do you do to fix it if you're not going to do what Deborah Arneson's doing?
Gee, Jim, you know, your members, the Mass Teachers Association, the Public Employee Unions, didn't worry about property taxes in this state that we're the third highest, sometimes the second highest in the country. And so you fought Prop 2.5 when we tried to cut property taxes. Your concern now for the regressive property taxes is certainly interesting, but I don't think the people in New Hampshire are going to buy it.
Let me try just one last time. What would you do to fix the property tax problem if you don't like Deborah Arneson's solution on the Democratic candidate for governor? What would you do to fix the problem with the property tax in New Hampshire? What's Steve Morrow going to do it?
The first thing I think they should do is try to get an initiative petition process in New Hampshire so that even if they do someday have another kind of tax for whatever reason, they will always have the ability to put a question in the ballot to cut that tax when it and the property tax go out of control, which is what happens in any state that thinks that it's a legitimate game and you can trade off taxes.
Do you feel your blood pressure go up just a little when we start talking tax politics as opposed to these other issues? I don't know about you, but my face is getting redder. I feel a little hotter. I don't know what it is.
New Hampshire is sort of the place out there where we tax activists look for where we're going to go when we die.
When we don't die, when we retire. Well, before we die or retire, there's another tax issue that's pretty hot, and that's the tax issue in the presidential campaign. You have a guy who's running on the Democratic ticket, Bill Clinton, who is saying, I'm going to raise taxes. He says he's only going to raise taxes on the rich, but a lot of people believe when you say that, it means they're going to be raised on somebody else. You have a Republican by the name of George Bush, and he's still in the race as far as I know, who says, I broke my pledge one time, but I'm never going to break it again. Tax politics is at the center of that also. If you care about tax policy from the perspective of a Barbara Anderson, where do you fall in that race?
You know, I've got to tell you, I mean, Jim's having an awful time here because with Ross Perot about to come in the race, he now has two candidates who said they're going to raise taxes, along with Bush, who I think finally means it when he says he's not. So Jim is going to have to weigh whether Clinton's going to raise taxes more than Perot until he gets down to the exact penny about which one raises taxes more. And that's the bumper sticker that goes on Jim Braude's car.
Well, let me just tell you something. It took George Bush about 2 years to eat his words, those read my lips. And my guess is before your career is done, you're going to join him at the dining room table. Don't you think that's pretty safe to say?
In your dreams.
Well, that may be the case. Talking about these issues, by the way, both on the presidential front, talking about them particularly as it relates to those 6 hot congressional races in Massachusetts, are 2 people who came in second in probably the highest profile races. We'll be back with them and you in 2 minutes.
Welcome back to Talk of New England. This is Barbara Anderson and Jim Braude, and I'm going to introduce the guests because they're from my congressional district, the 6th congressional district, the 2 people who fought hard, tough, and courageous primaries and are now here to help us analyze. One thing in the 6th district, and nobody's ever going to know who I voted for up there, but I'll have to tell you that all of us political, especially you, all of us political junkies have to regret the fact that we're not going to see Sandy Tennant and Barbara Hilt debate the issues of the 6th district, but we are going to see them here tonight to discuss the other races that are pending because of their unique experiences having run as candidates, something I've never done and Jim has never done and you're never going to see me do either. So I admire the fact that you get out there into the arena, get covered with the dust, and as someone who's been in the arena along with Jim on ballot questions and have lost one, I kind of have a sense of how it feels. So my commiserations with both of you, and my congratulations on a hard-fought battle. Also, for people that don't live in the 6th CD, I should just say I was looking at some vote totals before we came out here today, and you probably know this, but the largest vote totals in a Democratic primary in Massachusetts were in your race. The largest vote totals in a Republican primary in Massachusetts were in your race, so obviously there was a lot of interest. Before we start talking politics, though, as Barbara said, we only do issues. We don't try to go out and sell ourselves in campaigns, and I don't mean that in a crass way. What's it like, I'll start with you, Barbara, after a race that is so high profile, front page of the newspaper from weeks and weeks, if not months, you wake up the next morning to find out you've lost by what, less than 700 votes out of over 95,000. What does it feel like when you wake up that morning?
Not great.
Really?
I worked very, very hard for 6 months. I had wonderful people supporting me. The campaign built a tremendous amount of momentum and interest, and we were able to go up with television ads, and that got a lot of people aware of my candidacy, and we felt very confident going into Election Day.
But how hard is it that when you get up the next morning and the alarm clock goes off and you know it really happened and you got the newspaper there that says whatever it was, 646, what do you do
Jim, you
that
sound
morning?
like the reporters who walk up and say,
can't
how
help
does it
it.
feel that your entire family just perished in a fire?
But does it feel like that? I mean,
But
does
in
it feel
my
like a-
case, we were not totally resolved. It was not until 2 days later that we finally decided we could not go through a recount, that it didn't look like it was worth it, that we could possibly overturn that many votes. So there was that period of time of wondering, will we still have a chance to win this? But it didn't seem like a good possibility.
Well,
Sandy,
of course,
people-
you did have another person in your race. So if the two votes were total, your vote and this third person, you actually did defeat the
That's
incumbent
right.
Nick Mavroulis. Is
He
that
only
correct?
got 47% of the vote, and we would have won, quite frankly. But who knows?
Sandy, you have a reputation before this fairly rough and tumble battle with Peter Torkelson. You were the executive director of the Republican Party for how many years?
4 years.
Through the Mike Dukakis period and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
You had a very, very tough race. Same question to you. What did it feel like the next morning, really after some pretty heavy charges back and forth, some clear political differences on things, well, the whole spectrum of things that I'm sure you'll talk about.
Right.
How do you feel the next day?
Well, the hardest part is probably for your family, but it was interesting when I called that night when we saw the results. I called everybody together. My children in a room said, we didn't win, we're going to go downstairs now. And my son AJ said, well, does that mean we can start dancing? so you put life in perspective. I'm now coaching Pop Warner football. I'm back to my company, getting publicity. Some wanted, some unwanted. So life goes on. But I think the things that the reason I ran, and Barbara, you and I fundamentally disagree, but the reason I ran is because I want to see a balanced budget. I want to see a line item veto. I want to see a lot of those things that we've fought for a long time happen. And by the way, Peter Torkelson and I agree on all of those things. So I think this is the greatest opportunity we're going to see in many, many decades in the 6th District to win it. And I'm doing everything I can to help Peter Torkelson.
So don't forget, too, largely because of Sandy's efforts to help build the Republican Party, you had these races out there. It used to be, I remember this, and I'm an independent, but I still remember Republicans trying to talk anybody into running against an incumbent.
Like,
this year you had two people, two good people where I actually was standing in the voting booth for quite a long time.
Voting for who, did you say?
Because I had to look at two of my very good friends, Sandy Tennant and Peter Torkelson. And this, considering what we're looking at, all of us in the presidential races where it's going to be choose the least awful, here was a case for people in the 6th District, people like me, to try to pick the best of two really great people, just as they had in the race between Blute and Lionette.
Well, let me ask you though, you
This
said
is
you
good. It's a
and
good sign.
Peter Torkelson agreed on most things, I guess, except choice, so maybe it wasn't so hard for you to
No, wait a
endorse
minute.
it.
We
Peter
agreed on
did-
choice.
Oh, you did as well?
Yes, yeah.
What we
Peter's-
talked
Peter was
about-
a flip,
he had
from what I
flip-flop.
saw in your commercials.
Right, but yeah, look, he certainly took a lot of criticism from our campaign on explaining why he did it, and he did it. And the
And
public
he stood up
obviously
to it, and
listened.
people believed him.
I obviously would have liked to try to get more people in, but what we did is, you said, they got the largest Republican primary. I wish I kiddingly say to people, geez, if I could have got all that time and effort for 3.7% of the vote, I'd like to get more. But I think Peter Torkelson's going to win. And the areas we agree on, balanced budget amendment, line item veto, choice, the death penalty. If you go through our term limitations, elimination of special interest PAC money, which is probably the most corrupting influence, if you go through those, on every one of those issues we agreed, and Nick Mavroulis, the incumbent, is for all those
Except
things.
Sandy, you were saying in the
Nick
primary.
Mavroulis is about to be, or has been indicted, which is also a little
Well,
plus in
let's
favor.
talk about that in a second.
I don't even think that's going to look. The things I just talked about: balanced budget amendment, line item veto, term limitations, elimination of special interest PAC. 70 to 80% of the people in the 6th congressional district want to see those.
Yeah, but
things
Sandy,
happen.
I saw your commercials too, if I may. I saw
Yeah.
your commercials. They were pretty heavy. You said
Yeah.
there were differences.
Yeah.
You're saying there were basically similarities. When voters, and I'm one of them, sits at home and you see people go to war for ages, and the next morning, and you had a unity breakfast yesterday, you see these people who said the other one was so horrible, well, now he or she's the best choice. Let's turn to Barbara for a second. Yesterday you did have this unity breakfast. You and Nick Mavroulis had pretty dramatic differences on a whole spectrum of substantive issues.
Well, not
How
so
easy is
many.
it?
Not so many issues. The big issue that we differed on was the issue of a woman's right to choose. And that's going to make it very hard for some of the Democrats who care about that issue to support him. But I think when people look at the overall range of issues, the problems that have got to be addressed in this country, of the economy, the need for health care, environmental protection, they look at Peter Torkelson and his record on those issues and then compare what Nick Mavroulis has done in 14 years in Congress. I think they're going to make the decision decision to stay with the Democrat, because they know that they've got to have somebody who really cares about ordinary working men and women and jobs for them and their children, their health care. And Peter has no record on those things.
Well,
he has a 14% voting record on the environment.
He has a 100% voting record with the Citizens for Limited Taxation on Tax Issues.
I should just say this is what we would have heard then in the Tennant-Hilt debate that didn't quite happen, that may happen in the future,
the
right?
issues, and if we go right down them, term limitations. Peter Torgelson's 4 term limitations. I think you were against it.
But those aren't the issues that the voters care about. I was out there listening to the same voters you were, Sandy. I never heard anybody say, what's your position on a balanced budget? They wanted to know, what are you going to do about jobs? What are you going to do about the fact that we don't have health insurance? What are you going to do about the fact that our education system is just falling apart? There's no commitment to it. People really feel that it's time that we have some national leadership, and they know it's got to begin at the top, and that's why George Bush is not going to be reelected.
Sandy, before we hear from you, let's hear from Bob from Newburyport, who's going to tell us maybe how he would have voted if it had been a Tennant-Hilt race in the 6th Congressional District. Bob, thanks for being with us on the Talk of New England.
Hi, how are you today?
How you doing?
I'd like to make a comment about Barbara Hilt's run against Eric Albert and Nick Marvulis. And it appears fairly apparent to me that that was probably one of the dirtiest political tricks that I've seen since James Michael Curley put Protestant ministers into Catholic wards and just to ask them for the vote, for the reverse effect. I think Eric Albert was an obvious shill. I saw him leaning to the left of Marvulis on every point, when in fact he's really a Marvulis backer from what I can see. And I just think it was a terrible political trick.
Well, obviously you're a big fan of Eric Albert. Barbara, any comments on that notion?
Well, I think what I heard the voters saying is that Eric Albert was a shill, and that he was the reason why I didn't win the election. I have to agree with it.
I wonder, because I wondered about that obviously too, and I imagine you did too, Sandy. We all know how the political games are, but aren't shills usually more competent? I mean, do they normally, don't they usually try to hide? Do they normally go over to, as he did, to Marvulis headquarters right the night of the election and get hugs and kisses from everybody?
So we know that Barbara did, at least we know that Barbara didn't vote for Eric Albert.
No one was calling him a shill when he was pounding away on me. He was running in a Democratic primary, but he was coming after me on the Republican side. And I think that's Eric Albert. I happen to say early on he was a more... But, the real issue, and I think, Barbara, you talked about it, and Barbara, you did too, that Eric Albert didn't, again, on some of the issues that we just talked about that I think people really do care about, the deficit, the debt, getting jobs back, getting the economy online. He was out there talking about issues, and half the time he was agreeing with Peter Torgelson and I, and that was, we need a balanced budget amendment, we need a line item veto, we need something to get the economy under control again and get jobs back for people. And those are specific things.
Well, maybe he was a shill for the Republicans. Maybe he was put in there.
You know what? Here's how I...
Sandy, can I ask you a question? Is Ross Perot essentially the Eric Albert of the national campaign? I mean, there's an interesting similarity here.
It's interesting. Ross Perot could turn out to be a spoiler, but there are 2 people on the national ticket now that are going to be in favor of taxes. One's going to be Ross Perot, and the other's Bill Clinton. And if people want a clear choice, George Bush made a big mistake, and he's admitted it, and he's willing to say it, and he's not going to vote for taxes or support a tax increase again. But that happened because he had a Congress. For 30 years, in the last 30 years, there's been 56 tax increases, and that Congress has been dominated by one party, and it's the Democratic Party.
We discussed that last week, for those people who didn't tune in, and we found, going back to 1941, there was only been one time that the Republicans controlled the presidential office and Congress, and that was in 1953 under Eisenhower. All the rest of the time, the House was Democrat. A couple of times under Truman and Reagan, the Senate was Republican, but most of the time it was D all the way across.
But the issue hasn't been, in the last 20 years, every time Congress voted a $1 increase in taxes, they increased spending $1.28. That's been the problem, and it's been unilaterally controlled for 5 years.
It's 1992, Stan. Let's stay with the Perot thing, because we were talking about Eric Albert for a minute. If Perot really is a potential spoiler, and the rumor is he's going to be back in the race tomorrow morning, who's he hurt? And do you think that's his goal? Is his goal to end the candidacy of a George Bush or a Bill Clinton? Why is he in this race?
No more than Eric Albert's one.
Barbara?
It's hard to say. I was looking at the polls today, and it looks like in some states he'd hurt Clinton, in other states he'd hurt Bush. But I think it's unfortunate if he does get
I
in
think
there.
we're just
I don't think
talking about an
anybody
ego
can
here,
take
yes.
him seriously as a candidate. But he is going to give those voters who don't feel they can vote for either Clinton or Bush a place to go. And that could really throw the whole election off and throw it into the House of Representatives.
Which helps Clinton then, since the House is overwhelmingly Democratic and would probably go for Clinton over Bush, would they not?
This has been a very unique political year. I don't think anybody, and Barbara, we've both been through it. Even though we had a high turnout, I think we both felt the time and effort would have got more people. What the polls have shown is that Clinton's popularity, a lead in the polls, has kind of ballooned up and down, whereas Bush's has remained more constant.
Steadily bad.
Well,
Steadily bad. No,
it's
I don't
remained
think that's
constant.
true. Look at the polls, Sandy. Clinton has gone steadily up in the polls.
No, he's
and I
running-
think Bush's refusal to debate him is really going to hurt him.
Let's talk about your race, though,
he'll
for a
be
second.
the wimp again.
One more second before we
Come on
take a
again.
break. Clinton's got about a 30-point lead in Massachusetts right now. Let's assume that he wins Massachusetts. Does that dramatically help Mavroulis in that Mavroulis-Torkelson race? Is there a lot of coattail effect in Massachusetts in 1992?
I would think there would be some. I think that Clinton is going to win big in Massachusetts, and I think he'll help all the Democrats, including Nick Mavroulis.
What do you think?
Is he going to win big?
Well, I think there's a lot of variables going on in the 6th District that have nothing to do with national politics that I think will play a major role in that campaign.
Do you think he's going to hold his 30-point lead in Massachusetts? Clinton going to win our state?
I don't think he's going to hold a 30-point lead, and if Perot gets into the race, you don't know what's going to happen. You just don't. A lot of people are upset. But I don't think you should write off the Perot people, because there are a lot of people out there, and I found them when I was campaigning. One of the two major things they were talking about was the debt and bringing ethics back into government. And I think those are two things that a lot of people believe in. If Perot targets those two things, I think he's going to develop a following.
Well, speaking of Ross Perot, we're going to be back in a couple of minutes and not just talk about him, but to talk about the 6 hot congressional races in Massachusetts with 2 people who are part of one. Back with you in 2 minutes. There are 2.
Welcome back to Talk of New England. We're here with our guests, Representative Barbara Hild and Sandy Tennant, both who just ran tough races in the 6th Congressional District, and they're going to help us analyze the rest of the districts and what's going to happen in November.
Yes, indeed. And we're going to start with the first CD. And as I said, in the spirit of full disclosure a couple of minutes ago.
Congressional District.
All right,
Most
I keep
people think a
saying
CD is something you put and play music on.
Well, some people consider
Stop
that to be
showing off
more
what a pro
important,
you
actually.
are,
Let me
right.
say congressional district. In the 1st Congressional District is somebody by the name of John Olver. As I said before you both were on the show, founded my organization. A former colleague of yours is a state senator.
Great.
And you'll get a chance to say that. And running against Pat Larkin, who my understanding was a former aide to Silvio Conte, who died, and that led to the special election when John Olver won. What's your sense of that race, Sandy?
My sense is it's going to be a very close race. Steve Pierce lost in a special election in a razor-thin race, and the issue that was the deciding issue in that race was choice. Oliver being pro-choice, Pierce being pro-life. That won't be there this time. Larkin's also been campaigning now for a good 6 months, has gained momentum, has a lot of support from the former Conte people, and I think there's a real differential on tax issues where, from your school, he wants more taxes and Pat doesn't, when I think...
Further, he's got a brother who's a state rep that you served with, Barbara.
Yes,
He's a Democrat,
by the way.
But I assume some of that
I
support
disagree
will
with
go to him.
Sandy. I don't think it's going to be a close race. I think it's a situation where the voters already had a chance last time to speak. They put in John Olver. He's had less than 2 years to prove himself. He's made a good record in Congress. He's done nothing to discredit himself. And I think the Clinton coattail effect will help
That's good. He had
in
nothing
that
to do
race
with bounce
too.
checks, and he's known. I mean,
He
now
didn't
that has
bounce
become
any
an
checks.
asset. You're right.
No, but
He
he's
does have a 12% rating with the National Taxpayers Union. So, from the taxpayers' point of view, he hasn't been that successful.
You got to understand, you got to put in perspective. From Barbara's point of view, that's not an important issue. I happen to fundamentally disagree.
What's important is what the voters care about, what they're concerned about.
And they're concerned about being
are-
taxed and spent into the ground. They're concerned about a 200...
They're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about the lack of leadership in this
And the
country.
debt.
And they're going to, in the 1st District, they're going to vote George Bush out. And they're going to vote Clinton in, and Oliver's going to be
I wish
there
I
with
could
them.
be assured as you were that I knew what the voters wanted. But I think what they want is an end to $1 billion a day and more spending than this country brings in. And John Oliver's part of that problem.
Well, let's talk about that. John
Oliver
Oliver's also an incumbent,
right.
And there was a notion that this was this vicious anti-incumbent year, other than Chet Atkins, who obviously lost overwhelmingly to Marty Meehan in the 5th congressional district. The incumbents in the Democratic Party won. Is John Oliver's incumbency help him in the 1st congressional district? He's only been there a little bit more than a year.
I don't think it hurts him. And I think probably it helps him more than anything. John Oliver is a very bright congressman. He's made a good record. I think that he's very in tune with the people of his district, and he's a progressive. And I expect that he's going to do very well.
Sandy, when you were head of the Republican Party, throw the bums out was a big thing because everybody was Democratic. Does that work for Larkin in the 1st congressional district?
Well, I think one of the reasons, actually, that Barbara is sitting here and not running...
This Barbara.
Right,
yes.
And not running for Congress is because primaries aren't a good reflection against anti-incumbent feelings because there's a low turnout. I think 8% voted in the Republican primary, 25% in the Democratic primary. When you get 70 to 80% of the people coming to the polls, and if Perot gets in, I think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see much more anti-incumbent sentiment surfacing. I think you're going to see a lot of people leaving Congress this year.
How about the second CD? Another first-term incumbent, Richard Neal, former mayor of Springfield, won with, I think, roughly 48% of the vote against 2 opponents. Ravosa on the Republican side, who had no opponent in the primary, from what I understand.
Young city councilor, very young,
lively, very likable.
What's your sense of that race, Sandy?
I think that's probably the dark horse race in the state, to be honest with you, because he's coming out of a city base. He's been able to raise funds, and I think he's got a very fiscally conservative message. And if there is an anti-incumbent sentiment out there when people do come to the polls, Mr. Neal has had a few problems during his first 2 years in office. I think you'll see it reflected. He's a long shot, but I think he's a dark horse, and he's doing all the things you need to do to be in a position to upset someone.
What's your sense, Barbara?
Well, Springfield is the base, and it's a Democratic district, so I expect that Neal will be able to hold on to it.
How much does that matter, though? One of the things, I was looking at the registration differential, Democrat versus Republican, not looking at the independent today, and one of the things that impressed me was in most of these districts, 3 and 4 to 1, and then I said to myself, well, wait a second. There was a guy by the name of Bill Weld who was sitting in that chair last week who, with a 3 or 4 to 1 differential, Republican, the Democrat, beat John Silver, the Democrat. Does it matter that people are registered as Democrats overwhelmingly as opposed to Republicans? Does that matter anymore?
Well, I think it does in most cases. The reason why Bill Weld was elected was because Democrats did vote for him, who just couldn't bring themselves to voting for John Silver.
And don't forget us unenrolled people.
Yeah, and that's the key to the election, and where you're going to see a major change is, again, primaries are small universes. Why Tony Ravosa will be significant, he is an elected city councilor who's got elected in a Democratic city. So when they get to the final, it's not Democrat or Republican. It's going to be for someone who stands for the issues that they believe in. I think that's why I see Tony Ravosa as a dark horse.
You know, Sandy, as someone who I didn't know but used to read in the paper all the time and see on television, what I haven't heard you say in either the 1st or 2nd congressional district, not CD, I've learned my lesson, is the Republicans are going to win. They're going to blow away those incumbents. They're going to win those races strongly. You seem to be saying they have good shots, but in this year of anti-incumbency, in this year where everybody wants change, aren't you be a little tepid in your support for the Republicans?
I'm being candid. Let's move to the 3rd. And
let's move to the 3rd.
Peter Balut is going to blow Mr. Early away, and I'll say it unequivocally.
But let's first ask Carol from Peabody, who is, of course, from the 6th congressional district, what she has to say.
Welcome, Carol.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to commend Barbara Hills on an excellent campaign. And I had voted for Nick Mavroulis, but I just wanted her to know that in the future, that Democrats definitely stand behind someone like her.
Wait, I'm sorry. You said you voted for Nick Mavroulis this year?
Yes.
Against Barbara?
Right. But I want Barbara
Why?
to know that in the future, that people like myself would definitely back her.
Why?
Carol, can I ask you a question? Why? All of us are whispering under our breath. Why? If Barbara is so good, and a lot of people thought that, obviously only 600 more and she would be the Democratic nominee, why'd you vote for Representative Mavroulis?
Why? Because we feel that Nick Mavroulis has done a wonderful job. And the issue, like Barbara Hill said, is jobs, and I think he's brought jobs to the 6th district, and he's done an excellent job. I don't think anyone can find anything wrong with any of the things that he's done for the 6th district.
How do you think?
You could only praise all the work that he's done.
How do you think he's going to do in the final against Peter Torkelson?
I think he's going to win, and he's going to win big. There's no way that the Democrats are going to lose that seat.
Barbara?
It doesn't bother you that he's indicted?
Not at all. I don't believe half of it. I don't believe any of it, actually.
Half?
That's what I should say.
But you do believe half of it.
I don't
So
believe
that's
half of it. I'll retract that. I don't believe any of it. Excuse me.
I think that's what happened in this race.
I think
many people.
I think it's unfair that he's been tried and
Right.
convicted in the newspapers.
I would have to agree with
by
that.
the newspapers.
I think
but as
Nick
you can
Marvulis
see, the
got a-
people still stuck by him.
I think Nick Marvulis got a tremendous backlash vote because people felt what happened to him was fundamentally unfair, and it was.
Well,
The press
it was
tried
unfair,
him
but
in the
I think
press.
he got a vote because he did an excellent job.
Well, it's also, Carol, I think
People
what's...
tried, when he won, everyone tried to say it was a sympathy vote because of his brother. I think the vote was there because of the work that he did and the job that he did in Congress.
Well, there's also, I think one of the things Sandy was touching upon is not only is there this anti-government passion that's out there, but there's also an awful lot of anti-media passion, whether it was Dan Quayle in 1988 going to his hometown and beating people into a rabid frenzy about the fact that the media was pursuing him on the draft issue, whether it's this Marvulis thing, Clinton doing a pretty masterful job around the draft thing, turning it back on the media. There's a lot of that anger, and a lot of people think that actually helped Nick Marvulis in your race, that backlash.
Let's see what Barbara thinks.
against
It was her race.
Well, I think there was some backlash, and it's definitely a sympathy vote, not only because of his troubles, but his brother dying just before the election. But I think the voters really do feel that he should get credit for the things that he did do right and for the jobs that he helped to bring to the district. And I have to agree with the caller that I think that the congressman will be reelected because those are the concerns people have about jobs and the economy, and those are more important than anything else right now.
Let's talk about the third congressional district that you started talking about a minute ago, Sandy. Clearly a hot one. We have Joseph Early. How many checks? 142. He's rumored to have bounced. He won just about 40% in, what, a 5-person race?
I don't think it's a rumor. I think he pretty much did bounce 142.
He denied it. Clearly that's what the House committee involved in that did. And he's running against Peter Blute, who's a Republican rep, got a pretty strong reputation, beat a very strong challenge back from Dave Lionette, who was interestingly the chief proponent of term limits in the House, which is one of his claims to fame. Starting with you, Sandy, what's your sense of that race, which is really going to be a hot one?
My sense is you've got a great candidate in Peter Blute. Who's a good communicator, who will go to the people, and it'll be a wide, broad-based campaign where you're going to have 250,000 people voting, and Mr. Early's gone, I believe. And I think, just to go back, I think what happens when an incumbent is there as long as Joe Early and Nick Marvulis is, they do a lot of favors for people, and those favors build up over time, and they show up in primaries. When you get into a race where there's going to be 250 to 300,000 people voting, people want to vote for someone who's saying, I do want to limit terms. I do want to eliminate special interest PAC money that leads to corruption, because they believe those things, but they're never able to equate it in a primary election, because usually they go in and vote for the person because he's their friend. When you get into a general election and you start hitting those numbers, I think you're going to see Peter Blute beat Mr. Early handily.
Barbara, can I ask you about an issue that matters a lot to you in that race? You are one of the champions of the pro-choice movement in Massachusetts, and one of the things that happened in that race is that 2 anti-choice candidates, Joe Early and Peter Blute, beat back challenges from strong pro-choice candidates. Does that make a pretty major statement about how important choice is in a year when, as you said a minute ago, economics, jobs seems to be everybody's #1 concern?
Well, I think it would have been a deciding issue had there been only one pro-choice candidate running against Early in the primary. But there were several candidates to choose from. And his long record and strong constituent support carried it for him. But I can't call that election. I think it's going to be very, very tough.
Well, choice is important.
Peter Blute is very conservative. He's very far to the right.
Serves with you in the
He's far to the right of you, Barbara. That doesn't necessarily mean far to the right of most people.
Relative deprivation.
If you look at the Republicans in the House, I mean, certainly compared to David Lionette, he's much farther to the right. And I think that people will have to look at issues other than the issue of choice, because there is no difference between the two on that.
But then in your district, in our district, in the 6th Congressional District, the choice side is now Peter Torkelson's against Marvulis, the anti-choice side, so then there should also be an impact there, shouldn't there?
I don't think Peter Torkelson can be trusted on the issue of choice.
As Sandy Tennant said in the campaign.
As Sandy said, he's changed his position now 3 times. To get elected this time, he decided he had to be pro-choice.
I don't think that's accurate. I've known Peter a long time.
Since I made the charges, let me.
Yeah, since you made
You
the
asked me
charges.
when we started You know, I used to be, when I was the head of the Republican Party, I'd come up and sound the drumbeat. I have to say, Barbara, in the heart of hearts, I know how you feel about choice, and it's the same way I do. You can't possibly, with good conscience, go forward and say you're supporting Nick Marvulis on the issue that was so important to you in your heart. And I know your followers won't. You're doing exactly what you have to do because you might run down the road and you're a partisan on this issue. I'm not anymore. I'm out of politics. And now
other people made the issue of choice. They tried to tell me that it was the most important issue. It is a very important issue, but there are too many important issues like the economy, health care, education, the environment, that Peter is wrong on.
Let's hold it for a second.
People have to
Speaking of issues, just 1 second. Let's have Al from Woburn tell us what issues matter most to us. Hi, Al. Welcome to Talking New England.
Hi there. How are you?
We're well, thanks.
I got to make a comment.
Feel free. That's why you called.
You Republicans aren't doing your homework. And I can understand why, because you don't have time, but you're not doing your homework at all.
What does that mean, Al?
Well, are you aware that, you know Laffer, who designed the
You're talking about Arthur
supply
Laffer?
side economics?
Yep.
Yes.
He just come out for Clinton. Are you aware of that?
Oh, yes. We talked about that last week.
And are you also aware that many of the CAOs of the biggest corporations in the country are for Clinton now, come out for Clinton?
Yes.
I didn't know you were aware of that.
So I think the consensus, Al, that you're saying is, and I think this is no great secret, is that George Bush may be in a little bit of trouble. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
Oh, no, not a little bit of trouble. He's in a great bit of trouble.
How about the Republicans in Massachusetts in these congressional races? How do you think they're going to fare, Al?
Well, the only one I'm basically familiar with is the 6th district with Marvulis.
Yeah.
Because I worked that territory when I was working.
Mm-hmm.
And Marvulis brought a lot of business into that territory.
Well, you live in the 5th, though, right?
Brought into there.
You live in the 5th district. Do you have a choice there?
I live in the 7th district.
I'm sorry, in the 7th district.
Al, we
Yeah.
thank you for calling, but we got to go to a break. We're going to get to further calls with Sandy Tennant, Barbara Hilt, Barbara Anderson, and I'm Jim Braude when we come back in 2 minutes to Talk in New England.
Welcome back to Talk of New England, and we're now moving into the 5th Congressional District in a discussion with our guests, Barbara Hilt, Representative Barbara Hilt, and Sandy Tennant. So we have Marty Meehan versus Paul Cronin. Sandy?
I think it'll be tougher for Paul Cronin with Atkins gone. However, Paul Cronin has run before. He's a very good public official during his day. He got taken out in the Watergate era.
He was a member of Congress, yes.
Right, he was a member of Congress. He gets swept out in that era. Was caught on the wave, and I think he's on the other side of the wave now. He ran for governor, and I think he missed by a very small percentage getting into the final through the convention. If he had, I think he was talking about issues people cared about. He's a good candidate.
Barbara, Meehan crushed the incumbent Atkins, the only incumbent to lose. What does that mean for the final?
His candidacy really excited people. It wasn't just an anti-Atkins vote. I think they were really excited about him. He's young, he's energetic, he's got a fantastic organization, and I think the people who wanted to vote against an incumbent have had their chance. Cronin is, however, somebody who has been in public office before, served the district, but he was defeated. I don't know if he can come back. It'll be a very interesting race to watch.
And let's just briefly, on the 10th Congressional District, another incumbent, Gary Studs, what do you think is going to happen there?
I think he is going to be in a very tough race because of John Bryan, the third independent in that race. I think he has a track record, has got votes. He was a Republican, switched to independent. I think Daley is going to do well in this race, and I think that's
Daley, the Republican nominee.
Right.
Yeah, but that doesn't make it tough for Studs because you have a situation like Representative Hilt had, where you have the former Republican, John Bryan, now an independent, and Daley both running against Studs. That simply splits the anti-Studs vote, doesn't it?
Well, I think on certain issues, Bryan will eat into some of Studs' former base because he's been running. This is his third time.
He already has the
on.
endorsement of the Republican committee in Quincy, I understand it, which is unheard of. You wouldn't allow that when you were in there, would you, Sandy? You'd
Barbara,
put your foot
Studs
down.
is going to also be the chair of one of the most powerful committees, particularly for that district. Does that sort of do it?
It's critical to that district, and people are aware of it. His seniority, he's been very effective, and I think that he did better than expected against the challenger, Paul Harold. I expect that Studs is going to come out of this very well.
You know, I think Massachusetts is a good example for the country. We can go through each, Nick Marvulis, Bonnie Frank, Jerry Stutz, and all these people and talk about what a wonderful job they do back in their district. And some of them have done some great constituent service. But our country as a whole has a major, major problem with the institution of Congress. And I think this year, perhaps more than any other year in the history of this country, people are going to say we have to change the institution, and that's going to even mean voting against someone that's done me a favor, because I know that they've led to this huge deficit, $4 trillion.
Well, isn't that same spirit, though, what's going to be the death knell for George Bush? Let's assume you're right. That means George Bush's history on November 3rd.
I would argue absolutely to the contrary. George Bush has gone forward with an economic program to reduce taxes, to cut spending, and every time he goes forward with that, the democratically controlled Congress, and that Congress has been controlled for 5 years longer than Castro's ruled Cuba by one party, the
Democratic Party. I want you to listen, your nose just grew a little longer when you said George Bush was going to win. I want to make that clear.
Wait, that was his opinion. Don't give the impression he was lying.
Dane
That's his
from
opinion.
Haverhill.
He's doing the best he can with a very difficult situation.
We're joined by Dane from Haverhill, who's also from the district where these two fine people ran. Dane, thanks for joining us.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you quite well. How are you?
I just wanted to know, do you feel,
Who are you
I always
to?
get double talk on this question, but...
Who are you talking to, Dane?
I'm talking to all of you.
Fine.
Did President George Bush have the compromise to get a few of his things done through Congress? Or was this just something that he had done on this tax increase? I mean, he wanted a few things done. He had to give in to Congress. No, I want the true story on this. We keep getting double talk about this.
Can I speak to that, by the way? I happen to think the Democrats' criticism of George Bush on the merits of signing that tax increase actually is as illegitimate as you suggest. The Democrats thought it was a good idea. They moved Bush on it. I don't think that's the issue that'll sell. The issue that may sell is the question about George Bush saying, I'm giving you an ironclad commitment, read my lips in 1988, and people thinking he lied. So I think it's less the taxes than it is the lie. What do you guys think?
It's hard to give a 30-second soundbite, and that's what George Bush is being forced to do. He was very, very concerned about the national debt. It's $4 trillion. We're spending $1 billion a day more than we bring in as a country. There was a deal, a compromise with the Democratic leadership that he would increase taxes if they agreed to cut spending. Obviously, they didn't agree to cut spending because they're spending $400 billion a year more than they bring in.
But Sandy, if this president can't control, let's assume it is all Congress's fault. This is this irresponsible Democratic Congress. I don't think so, but let's assume it is. If George Bush, after 4 years, can't control these people, why is it going to be any better the next 4 years?
He's not going to be any better. He was a disaster for these 4 years, and I don't think people are going to be voting on the issue of did he lie to us about taxes. Yes, he did. What they're going to vote against him on is the fact that he has done nothing about the critical problems facing this country. The economy's in worse shape than it's ever been in. He hasn't addressed any of the problems of the need for national health care, our education system. Everything has been neglected by this administration, and he can't continue to put all the blame on Congress.
But Dane's question is so legitimate, which is...
Let me be specific. What George Bush tried to do, what he tried to do was a $500 exemption for people, enterprise zones. He tried an investment tax credit. He tried everything he could, Barbara, and for you to sit here when your party knocked down and wouldn't even allow to be debated on the floor of the House some of the things that would have created jobs in our country.
We tried all that. We tried all the trickle-down economics during 12 years of Reagan-Bush years, and look what they brought us.
Reagan-Bush years. Can I tell you what Reagan-Bush brought, in my opinion? It brought the free world. It ended the Cold War, and it did some. It brought during Reagan's years millions of jobs to this country. The reason
the longest sustained vote in the history of the country.
Millions of jobs have left this country.
And the reason we continue to face the problems we're facing today is because we continue to send people. Now, if you think Bill Clinton's proposal for $150 billion more in taxes and $220 billion more in spending,
I haven't heard him say that. That's what Bush is making up.
Then you're the only person in the country that hasn't heard him say it.
It's been in the newspapers.
Everybody's heard him say it.
Well, Sandy, if it makes so much sense, if it turns out George Bush isn't the problem, if Congress is the problem, if George Bush is going to solve our problems, then why is it that in every single state except Utah, when I read the paper this morning, people plan to vote for Bill Clinton to replace that guy?
Well, you know what? We've all seen polls. Barbara had a poll that said it looked like she was going to win. I've seen people that say they're going to. The poll that's going to count is the one on November 3rd.
We've heard that, but today, let's talk about today. As we came here on the show,
you asked
overwhelmingly people in this country say George Bush just can't cut it. We don't want to do it again.
No,
Why doesn't he want to debate? He doesn't want to debate
Sure he
because
does.
he has no record to stand on. He's been a failure.
It's interesting. It's funny because all Bill Clinton has to do is agree to the rules and they'll go debate. There's politics going on, and we understand that, Barbara, and you know as well as I. Look, George Bush has done several things right. He has led this country and done a good job internationally in bringing world peace. And I don't think there's anybody that would argue about it. If George Bush has any fault, it's that he is not a communicator. He has not taken his argument to the public and pointed out all of the programs that he's tried to get through Congress that haven't got through. And
He's had 3 years and 11 months to do it, Sandy.
Well,
on that note, if I may, Bill from Hudson, how do you feel about the presidential race? And does George Bush just have a communications problem, or is it more than that? Bill, you're with us.
Hello?
Hi, Bill from Hudson.
Yeah, I got a question for Jim.
Braude, you're talking to me.
Jim.
Yes, sir.
You had a very principled stand on getting question 2 on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And now it appears to me that principle goes by the board, and what you're saying is if you negotiate with Billy Bulger and a few others,
yes,
you can take in the game.
Jim in the hot seat.
If the people of Massachusetts vote on question 2 and they vote in the affirmative, who are you or any other group to sit down and negotiate?
I got you, Bill. Can I make a suggestion, Bill?
Yeah.
Barbara and I, we have about another minute with these 2 guests. When we come to the final 30 minutes, at the top of that half hour, I promise you that I will answer the question and Barbara will get a response. So can we move on to the next caller?
Was it a similar thing that George Bush might have had to go through in compromising? Is that what happened?
Nicely put, Sandy. Tom from Malden, can you join us with no questions about question 2 until 6 o'clock?
Okay.
Tom, how are you?
Very well, thank you. I wanted to address something to Representative Hilt. People are concerned about jobs, but I think people in this country are starting to wake up to the fact, or at least I hope they are, that the tremendous burden of taxation has a little something to do with the number of jobs that are created in this country. Government does not create jobs. Government just shifts jobs around. And when you talk about a congressman bringing home the bacon for the district, all that means is he's been able to steal it from some other congressional district.
So, Tom, what's your question? We only have 30 seconds.
When are you people going to realize that shifting the tax burden around and redistributing wealth does not create jobs? All that does is protect the powerful members of Congress who have managed to build up enough seniority that they can allegedly bring home the bacon for their district. All they're doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul, and that is not productive. All that does is redistribute wealth. It does not create wealth.
Barbara, you have 10 seconds to answer that question.
Absolutely right.
Tom, let Barbara, if we will, answer the question.
You're right. The problem has been the redistribution of wealth. We've given all the tax breaks in this country to the wealthiest 1% and put the tax burden on the middle class. We have got to change that. It's time. Don't you agree, Jim?
I agree completely. Well, we have no time for Sandy, but I want to say it would have been a wonderful debate with Sandy Tennant and Barbara Hilton. Maybe we'll get it a couple of years from now. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. We'll be back with you in 2 minutes for your calls and questions.
Welcome back to Talk of New England. This is Barbara Anderson.
And I'm Jim Braude.
And we're here all by ourselves now that Barbara and Sandy have left. But I certainly hope that, Barbara's still a state representative. I hope Sandy Tennant will stay involved in politics because he certainly does put up a fight, doesn't he?
He does indeed.
But before we get to more calls, Jim, there was a question that I thought was rather interesting myself. And would you like to answer that now for the
I wanted to make clear I wasn't avoiding the question. It just was we had 60 seconds left with these guests. But having said it, let's get to it. One of the things that Barbara and I have said at the beginning of both shows is that we're going to talk about 4 pretty hot ballot questions in Massachusetts. One of them was question 2, which my organization, the Tax Equity Alliance for Massachusetts, was sponsoring. Let me tell you what question 2 would have done. It would have required every single bank, insurance company, and publicly traded corporation in Massachusetts, those are the ones on the stock exchange, to disclose to the public what they pay in state taxes, their income, the tax breaks they get from the state, how much they get from a whole litany. What the caller was alluding to, and I assume most of you outside of Massachusetts, and maybe some of you weren't aware of, was the fact that in negotiations between the proponents, our side, and the opponents, most of the people in the business community, along with the governor of the state, a few Congress people, former Senator Paul Tsongas, and as the caller said, the Senate President Bill Bulger, and the House Speaker Charles Flaherty. We met for a few days this week, and in what was a fairly unprecedented agreement, reached a compromise on question 2. Now, I don't know, Barbara, before I talk to the issue the caller made about democracy, Do you know of a ballot question, at least in this state, which once it was put irrevocably on the ballot was settled before Election Day? Do you know of one?
Yes, the Ethics Commission, for instance, by common cause.
When did that happen?
Oh, it must have been, 1976, 78, somewhere around there. They had gotten the signatures, and there was an agreement, and the Ethics Commission was created from that agreement.
Well, one of the issues that the caller was speaking to, I don't think he was really speaking to the substance. I don't know where he was, but one of the concerns he had, which I frankly think is a legitimate concern, is the questions on the ballot, and it will be there on November 3rd. Question 2 will be there as drafted. And what happened is, as a result of this agreement, what is the voter supposed to do? Well, let me tell you technically what we agreed upon, and then we can talk about how democratic it is. Both sides agreed that if all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed on this settlement, and the settlement incidentally created a commission of 12 people, including some of those high-profile political leaders, as well as members from both sides, who will look at the whole business tax system. We got a slimmed-down version of that ballot question, which will require individual corporations, banks, and insurance companies to disclose at least tax and income information. What we're urging people is to vote yes with the notion that they're voting for the compromise. Having said that, a number of people, including that caller, were concerned that there's a democracy problem. Are we essentially taking away people's right to vote when we're telling them that both sides reach what we consider to be a fair agreement? We think a good compromise is better than voting on question 2. We think we improved it. How do people deal with it in 1972 on this ethics issue? Was there a big brouhaha about it?
Another thing was about 1980. There didn't seem to be, because we really did. Actually, what happened is they gave them pretty much what it was they wanted. They just didn't want it in the ballot. I think the question that he had, though, was can you as an organization make the decision for the people who would have made the decision on the ballot?
Well, I'm told that Bill from Hudson is actually still with us, and you may have been one, I'm not sure, of the more than 100,000 people who signed that question and put it on the ballot. Bill, what's your feeling about the notion of settlement and still having the question before the voters on November 3rd?
Well, Jim?
Yes.
I've just listened to everything you've said, and the bottom line here is that if, in principle, the publication of this information would have shown that the corporations in Massachusetts were not paying a fair share, how can you now say, in principle, because you are a principled man, I take it, that
my family thinks so.
Any 10, 15, or 20 other citizens can take and negate what the people of Massachusetts have so voted? That's not my definition of democracy.
I hear you.
And it's not my definition of ethics, and it's not my definition of principle on your part.
I hear you.
Because you have acted as the leader, of the providers in Massachusetts, and you are saying on principle, now you're going to do how can you convince me that this isn't a sellout?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I actually think you have a good point. First of all, it isn't a sellout. Let me tell you very briefly about the substance. You should not be concerned. Part of this compromise will ensure that the law will be, as of December of this year, that all of those banks, insurance companies, and publicly traded corporations that would have been covered by question 2 are still covered by it, and they will still have to report income information, profit information, as well as the taxes they pay to this state. So most of that information you're getting. But that doesn't cut to the underlying issue, which is when two parties, clearly not a million people sitting in a room who might be voting in November, sit down and make an agreement, does it take away people's democratic right to vote? Our feeling was, as well as the governors, leaders of the House and Senate, Paul Tsongas and Joe Kennedy, is if we had a better idea, a compromise without going to war for the next 6 weeks, that frankly that was in the public interest. You may disagree, Bill. What do you think, Barbara?
Jim?
I think the reason that the other side compromised or was willing to is because of the concern with our economy the way it is, that a battle between business and between Jim's organization, a public battle, wouldn't have been good for jobs for anybody.
Sure, Bill.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Look, people are going to raise this jobs, the economy. It's all a smokescreen, The basic fact is you went for the jugular vein. You got question 2 on the ballot. You terrified the corporations in Massachusetts. They seen that it would pass. They got you. They called you on the phone. They say, "Hey, Jim, let's sit down and do something so that we don't have to put out all of the dirty linen and get everybody peed." And now how are you any different than some of these characters that were kiting checks and everything else? Isn't principle what you're supposed to be standing for?
Yeah, Bill, I have to say you've been pretty eloquent about this, but let me just say, to make it even worse in your mind, the call didn't come from them to me, the call came from me to them. We knew we were way ahead. Our goal was, if we could sit down in negotiations and achieve the basic core of question 2, without having, let me just finish, Bill, let me just finish if I may, without having to cause the potential pain that a high-profile ballot campaign caused. If we achieve those goals, we were willing to sign on the dotted line, and that's what we did. I understand you're upset.
You are, but what about the voters of Massachusetts? Do they have any part in this, or do you just use them as a club to beat people into submission?
Well, let me just tell you something, Bill. First of all, people will still vote on November 3rd. Both sides are urging them to vote yes. And I should say to you, this compromise is not being enacted by me and a handful of people in a room. The compromise has got to be voted for by a majority of people in the legislature who represent people like you in Hudson and people across Massachusetts. So obviously you and others will have an opportunity to speak your voice. So thanks for calling.
One thing that did bother me about all of this is the Globe editorial, which seemed to imply there was something wrong with the initiative petition process because they had come to an agreement. And certainly the Globe loses no opportunity to attack the process that we've used, that your side has used. And I do want to point out that I think the initiative petition process either goes on the ballot so the voters can make the decision, or it at least creates a discussion on something that otherwise wasn't being discussed. So I don't think we can attack the process here as much as the Globe would like to see it disappear for both liberals and conservatives forever.
I think you actually raised 2 points, Barbara, that are worth mentioning. I think it is important, and I should have said this to Bill a minute ago, by filing this ballot question, we did bring people to the table. If he's not happy with the fact that we resolved it without having gone to the ballot, I understand that, I respect it, and I have some sympathy for that. The other issue you raise about the initiative process, I think we are one of maybe 26 states in the country that allow people to make laws on the ballot. Barbara is very well aware that when my organization was formed in 1987, we had a bumper sticker. It's still on my wall. She probably has it too. That says good tax policy doesn't fit on bumper stickers. And the notion was that making laws on the ballot really didn't make sense. Let me tell you why it changed in our case.
Because you kept losing.
Well, no, we tried, exactly. We tried to get this issue through the legislature in 88, 89, 90, and 91, and we got it through the House one year, the Senate another. The feeling was we had tried representative democracy. It hadn't done what we thought was appropriate, and so we went directly to the voters, got 100,000 signatures, and getting back to Bill, were it not for those 100,000 signatures, not only would there have been no ballot question, there would be no law requiring the kind of disclosure that will happen in December of this year.
Which is exactly what we did, of course, with Proposition 2.5 when the legislature wouldn't respond. Great process, and I'm sorry those of you in all the states surrounding us and other people listening to this show, watching this show, don't have the process. I wish everyone in the country had it. But let's hear what Vincent from Billerica has to say.
Vincent, welcome.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Hi, Jim.
How are you?
I have two things
Sure.
I'd like to say. First, to Barbara, if we use the campaign, the Republican campaign way of measuring Bill Clinton's taxes, then the way I figured, Bill Weld raised taxes somewhere around 400 times.
Who, Bill Weld? Bill Weld's never raised taxes.
Well, let me explain to you. What the Republicans said about Bill Clinton was that every racing day was a tax, because if you didn't have a racing day, and you opened a racing day, and you taxed those races, then that was a tax.
Yeah, that was an appalling attack on Bill Clinton. The tax burden in Arkansas is the 48th in the country. There are a lot of things you might want to say negative about Bill Clinton, but that he's a big taxer certainly isn't one of them.
Well, then you agree with me. Then,
oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Vincent, let me just say one more thing. The New York Times did a piece last week that said, using the exact same criteria that was used by the Republicans about that 128, quote, tax increases in Arkansas, during the Reagan-Bush years, taxes were raised 205 times.
I understand. I just wanted to bring it home.
Oh, yeah. No, that's totally illegitimate.
Of course it was, and it was absurd.
What's your second point, Vincent?
The other thing that keeps coming up, and Sandy Tennant brought it up again, he has no credibility.
Well, maybe not with you, but you certainly can't say that about all of us.
What were you saying, Vincent?
He's still looking for a smoking gun out in Springfield, so he's got his problem.
What's your second point?
Let me explain my second point. He said that Mr. Bush had to make a compromise on his no new taxes pledge. Well, if you read my lip speech, he said they'll back me against the wall and I'll say no. Then they'll try again and I'll say no.
They'll push.
Then they'll push me and I'll say no. Then I'll say, read my lips. So how can people keep saying they backed them against the wall? That was the whole idea of his speech. They were
Yeah,
going to back him
there's no
against.
doubt, and that, of course, is why George Bush is in trouble now. And it's also, however, the reason why George Bush will not raise taxes in his next 4 years, should he win this, because the Republicans won't let him, since they've seen the damage that sort of broken promise can do.
Well, there's also an issue, Vincent and Barbara. One of the questions is, how much sense does it make for any candidate to try to make an ironclad pledge and basically take one of the critical ways of balancing budgets off the table? Let's assume you're an anti-tax person, as Bush purports to be, Bill Weld purports to be, you clearly are. Does it make sense to even remove that as a potential way to resolve budget crisis, service diminution, and then basically say all you've got left is to cut services? Most people don't want services cut.
It made sense here in Massachusetts. That's one of the reasons Bill Weld got elected. That's why he's so popular now. But more important, to your point of view, I think the only reason he has been able to get spending under control and save our bond rating in Massachusetts was because he made that promise and kept his word. So therefore, the legislature had no choice but to cooperate. They didn't have the votes to override his veto. It's a perfectly legitimate premise if you believe, as we do, that they don't have a right to raise taxes, and that won't do any good because it'll just
Barbara,
make the
there's a problem,
situation
and
worse.
Vincent, if I may, one of the problems on the federal level is George Bush says, trust me this time, don't worry, I'm not going to raise taxes. And by the way, don't worry, I'm not going to cut entitlements. And don't worry, I'm not going to cut this program. And don't worry, I'm going to do a tax credit for parental leave so we don't have to do this parental leave bill. When you add up all this stuff, this is the same guy who's saying he needs a balanced budget amendment. But if you do the math, there is no possible way he can balance a budget if all those pledges are met on the spending and the tax side.
However, it doesn't add up for Bill Clinton either, who promised everything conceivable to every special interest group that he's going to do and only raise taxes $150 billion. So either way, their math isn't that great.
Vincent, one final question. Do you believe that George Bush really means it this time, whether he's right or wrong? Do you think he's telling the truth this round?
I'm sorry. I couldn't believe George Bush on anything. I never did, and I don't now. But one other thing with Bill Weld, he's done some good thing. But let's remember, he kept all the taxes that Dupac instituted in there.
No, that's not true. That's not accurate. I'm sorry, that's not accurate. The service tax was repealed, and the income tax at 6.25 went down to 5.95.
You're right. He let it expire, but he had a lot of those taxes going.
About $1 billion. You're right, Vincent. You're both right.
To be fair to Bill, he did have a lot of those taxes going for him, and he kept them in place. But he did keep his promise on the whole, except where it comes to the cities and towns. He didn't give back the money that he said he would.
Vincent, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Bill from Westfield, you're with us next on Talking New England.
Good evening.
Hi, Bill.
Good evening, Bill.
I'm sitting here trying to frame a statement, and I'm having difficulty doing it.
Okay.
The reason I am is I've watched a number of shows, and I read the papers, and I watch TV, and everyone is debating Bill Clinton versus George Bush and Bill Weld and Proposition or Question 2 or whatever.
And
I don't really think any of those things are the issues that people who are concerned about the American economy are concerned about.
what do you want him to be debating?
What I'd like to be debating, and I guess I have to say something right here too. I don't want to see them debating anything. I'd like to see them do something.
Well, what do you want done? Whether it's Clinton?
What I think is there's some fundamental solutions that the American economy has to go through in order to recover from what has probably been 30 years of decline.
Bill, you have 15 seconds, unfortunately, until we go to break,
I'd like
to tell
to see
us what they
go
are.
in the same direction that Japan and Europe is going. I'd like to see government in partnership with the financial industries and private industry and attack the basic problems. And I think the caller that called in earlier was right. Government doesn't create jobs, and it never will.
Bill, let me ask you one last question. Ross Perot talks a little bit more about those kinds of issues than maybe Clinton and Bush do. Are you a Perot sympathizer on these kinds of issues?
Being candid with you, I really haven't heard Perot come out with something concrete. The only person I saw that even seemed to have a glimmer of what the issue is was Paul Tsongas when he was running.
Well, one interesting thing before we go to a break is that Paul Tsongas, you probably know, is joined with retiring Republican Senator from New Hampshire, Warren Rudman, on something called the Concord, as in Concord, New Hampshire Alliance, to try to deal with these very issues.
And if you're interested in that, do it quickly, because Paul Tsongas jumps from one thing to another, and we'll probably be doing something else by next month.
On that note, we'll be back with you in 2 minutes for more calls. Bill, thanks for joining us on Talk of New England.
Jim Braude, and a minute ago we had someone named Bill who had a very good point, I think. Jim, when he asked, why don't they do something instead of just talking about it? One thing that fascinates me is that both the Republican and Democratic platforms mention school choice and welfare reform. Since they all agree on this, why don't they go out and do it next week?
That's a very good question, but more importantly, if they all agree on this, why didn't they do it for the last 4 years?
Good question. So let's go to Al from Saugus. Maybe he's got an answer.
Hi, Al.
Yes, hi. Good evening. I have to agree with the previous caller about doing something. I mean, I'm a young person that's frustrated with government. You talked about earlier about George Bush raising taxes, and we all know that taxes are necessary, but I think what we have to look at is what are the taxes being used for? I mean, I would be in favor of more taxes and cutting spending in order to reduce the deficit. People do not realize that this $1 billion a day more than we're spending is really a major problem that's going to hurt this country. I guess people really don't understand what it's doing.
Well, Al, let me ask you a question right there. Everybody seems to agree, at least in polls, they think the deficit is this critical problem. What percentage of the public, if there was this national plebiscite tomorrow morning, do you think would say yes to a tax increase? Any tax of their choice, if every one of those dollars went to deficit reduction?
Wait a minute, that's not necessarily the question, because they keep talking about the peace dividend, now that they allegedly don't have to pay money on spending, and there is a peace dividend. People on your side often say, Jim, well, let's go out now and spend, because now we can restore programs that in fact were never really cut at all. The growth simply was slowed down. But this man, and I certainly, would say use it on the deficit. Is that what you would say, Al?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I looked at the figures. I think each year we're spending $300 billion a year just for interest. We're not paying down, we're just paying a minimum interest payment.
Yeah, but Al, see, the problem is Barbara and I have a slight disagreement. She says just the rate of increase was cut. In fact, that's not the case in things like healthcare, public education, areas like that. The issue is, if you're left, let's assume we use that whole peace dividend. One of the problems with Democrats and Republicans is they're trying to use it dozens of times over and over and over again. Let's assume it ultimately dries up and people say, yes, I care about the deficit. 81% or something said they thought it was one of the three most major problems in America. And people went to you, Al, and your neighbors and said, are you willing to vote for a tax increase
Why
to
should
reduce
he vote for a
Let's
tax
ask him
increase?
what he thinks.
He has already the peace dividend.
Well, Barbara, you know as well as I do, the peace dividend at some point is going to dry up. You can't use it for deficit reduction, for public education,
That's what I'm saying.
for
You
school
use it
choice,
for
for
deficit
healthcare.
reduction, because it's that deficit that is the reason we don't have any money to invest in this country. The banks are spending the money to bail out the deficit and buying T-bills.
Al, since Barbara's never going to let me ask you that question, let me ask you one final one that I think she will ask.
Let him answer your question.
Well, Al, would you vote for a tax increase if it went all to deficit reduction and you could pick the tax you wanted that you thought was fairest?
Well, I think I'm an unusual taxpayer. I'm an educated taxpayer. I don't think the average person really understands what's going on. I mean, this is where we have to break away from politics into real leadership, and I don't think our American system allows for leadership. I think we're so caught up in politics that that's what we're going to get, and unfortunately, 80 congressmen that are leaving Washington are going to leave and get their $1 million a year pension, and we're going to be left holding the bag, and the American people...
Can I tell you something, Al? I have to say, Barbara Anderson used to say to me when I first met, when we agreed on virtually nothing, as opposed to now when we agree on 2 or 3 things, your side doesn't trust the public enough. You don't think they're smart enough, you don't think they understand the issues enough, and that's why she would say they went to the ballot. We fought a ballot war in 1990.
We don't trust the public sector.
Well,
the politicians.
no, I'm talking about the public.
I trust the public.
No, I'm saying that you said our side didn't really trust the voters enough. What I learned in 1990 in a question 3 debate over tax cutting that was put on the ballot by Barbara, regardless of the outcome, is I think it is stunning how much the public understands. In my analysis, just one person, as to why the vote totals are so pitifully low, why the turnout is so low, is because the people do get it, but they feel just like you, Al, that none of the candidates, presidential, congressional, local, are really addressing the problem, so they get turned off to the solution and decide not to vote.
Well, look what they're doing to George Bush, because he raised taxes once. No, people do not realize, like I said earlier, that was to go to the budget deficit, and they're jumping all over him. I don't support George Bush, but in a way I understand what he did. Now, if one of these 2 candidates said, hey, listen, I'm going to raise taxes, right off the bat, the media, the opposition party is going to jump on and say, aha, y'all going to raise taxes.
Al, before you leave us, and we've got to move on to the next call, Bill Clinton is saying he's going to raise taxes, and he's anywhere from 10 to 30 points ahead, depending on the state in America. So he seems to be telling the truth, and it seems to be working. Thanks for calling, Al. Charles from Boston, you're with us next on Talk of New England.
Yes, first I'd like to start with a comment. Both of you would be better presidential candidates than either George Bush or Bill Clinton.
It's not much of a compliment, but thanks anyway.
I've been following you both, Team and Citizens for Limited Taxation, for a very long time, and at least you stick to the issues and stop the mudslinging.
You're
that
incredibly
is very nice. Thank you.
On that note, we're leaving and going home, I guess. Now, Charles, continue.
Okay, my basic question comes down to this. Isn't there really a connection between political reform, for example, term limitations, and things like tax reduction and spending, getting spending under control and getting the deficit under control? I'd like both of your thoughts on that, and I'll get off the line. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's the whole point of term limitation, is that the people who are incumbents in there, who are always reelected, after a while get caught up in the system, and they're only there to raise spending and taxes, and after they've had so many years now of doing that, it's time to try something new. So I think that you're absolutely right.
I have to say that both I and members of my organization, at least the leadership of my organization, were really, I guess, in the middle on the question of term limitations in Massachusetts, and it's now at least working its way to the ballot, theoretically, for 1994. We ultimately came out against it, not because we don't think there's a serious problem in politics, but because our sense was, talking about democracy, as one of my critics a few minutes ago did, Bill from Hudson, I think the term limits is undemocratic. If it turns out people have a problem with an incumbent, then in my judgment, they got to work hard to make sure somebody replaces that incumbent. Otherwise, what the assumption is that if you throw the bum out, as long as you get somebody new, you're going to have the problem resolved. I don't see that as a resolution at all. My guess is you got to run high quality, well-educated, at least on the issues, candidates, and make sure they're the people that represent you both in Washington and the State House.
But the power of the incumbency is so strong, and it's not a fair fight. That's the problem. There's no level playing field, and that's what I think term limitations is trying to level that field.
I should say to you, by the way, we're talking about ballot questions. On November 9th, the legislature in Massachusetts, in a joint session, will be deciding once again, or at least probably considering whether or not it will put the term limit question before the voters in 1994.
And of course the problem is the long-standing incumbents who run the Constitutional Convention don't want term limitation, so that is of course the battle. But let's hear from Claire from Brockton.
Hi, Claire.
Hi. This is an altogether different subject, and your show is almost over, but I'd like to know if you two can explain how well you cannot give the state employees their raises for the past 4 years.
I'm sorry, Claire, I didn't hear your question. Did you, Barbara?
Yes, she said she wants us to explain why Bill Weld hasn't given the state employees a pay raise in 4 years. Of course, Bill was only here for 2 years. The reason, I guess, that state employees aren't getting a pay raise is that the private sector is having a problem, too, with people being out of work altogether, and the money simply wasn't there because of the deficit.
Well, first of all, Claire, I should say to you that it's been 4 years, as you probably know, and probably a lot of the viewers do, since the state public employees have had a pay raise. And as a matter of fact, what is rumored to be happening on this Wednesday is that the legislature is going to pass a bill to give them at least part of the negotiated increase. It was negotiated several years ago. And then the issue is, when Bill Weld vetoes it, if he does, are there 2/3 in both the House and the Senate to override that? I should say to you, I don't know what the reason is, except that Bill Weld, who seems to run a 24-hour government by poll operation, believes that poor people and public employees, let me just say, are not very popular. And as a result, poor people's programs have been cut over the last 18 months. Public employees haven't gotten a pay raise. And the problem, beyond just the pay raise, is when you're a public employee and you know that your boss obviously doesn't feel terribly good about the quality of your work, at least not good enough to give you a pay increase.
You have no reason
it's hard to go to work and give that quality service.
Bill Weld has never said he doesn't agree with the quality of the work. The problem is,
but he says he'll veto a pay increase.
One of Mike Dukakis' last act in office, and heaven knows there were plenty of bad acts before he got out of there, raised the pay of state employees in order to give the person who was going to follow him a difficult time, and more of a deficit than Dukakis already left. So
Claire,
Bill Weld has managed to get this under control, and if he hadn't, a lot of state employees wouldn't be working now because the system would have collapsed.
On that note, you'll get a vote on Wednesday, and we should tell you about what's going to happen next Sunday if you return to Talk in New England with me, Jim Braude, and Barbara Anderson. Barbara, why don't you tell them about it?
Next week, since we're both very fond of ballot questions, there's still a couple left, and we're going to be talking about the first one, question 1 on the ballot, which is the tax on cigarette initiative.
And to go into a health fund, allegedly to do preventive work.
Allegedly to go into a health
Well, that's
fund.
going to be one of the issues we'll debate next week. And I should say, my understanding is it'll be the first televised debate between the proponents and the opponents of a 25-cent per pack increase to go into this fund. On that note, thanks for joining us. I hope you'll be with us next Sunday on Talk in New England, live from 5 to 6:30. Thanks again.
Good evening.